Kia ora, everyone. It actually feels quite irresponsible to stop the discussion we've just been having about homeless rangatahi and what needs to be done about that. So I really hope we can see this as an intermission into data land before we all get back to talking about that most critical issue. But thank you for coming to spend a little bit of time with us in this session. And I think it actually follows pretty nicely on from the previous sessions we've had today, because really what the session is about is outcomes, and particularly how can we use data to demonstrate outcomes, and especially to make the case for the investment to create more of those outcomes. And we've heard it when it comes to rangatahi, we've heard it when it comes to a lot of other groups in this conference. We need more investment, and we need more of the right kind of investment. So the question is, how do we use data and information to help us get that? And I thought it might be great to just start with a snap quiz of the group. But before I do, I should just introduce myself. Talofa lava, I'm Maria. I'm the CEO of Impact Lab, originally from Southland, now based in Auckland. And I'm here with my older brother, but I'm his boss. So if any of you get the experience of being the boss of your older sibling, you'll know what I mean. It's really great. And also we have Kate Slater from the Rata Foundation. And I won't talk too much about Impact Lab because we're not here for that, but Impact Lab and Rata Foundation have been working together to try and figure out how do we bring useful tools to the community housing sector to help improve that information flow about outcomes to help investment. So to just, I guess, set us up, hands up who here is already measuring outcomes in your organisation or using data to get a view of how people are experiencing what you're providing and whether it's useful to them. Oh, that's amazing. Okay. Who isn't really doing that yet but wants to? Okay. And who is sort of questioning what's even the usefulness of data, and maybe there's even some dangers to using it? Oh, interesting. Okay, that's not as many as I thought, because I think it is a fair and reasonable question as to whether we should be using data. Well, that's probably a great place for us to start. So I guess then what we'll aim to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about some of the ways that we're approaching this at Impact Lab with Rata and other NGOs and providers we're working with. And then I'll try and leave a good amount of time actually for questions, because I think that's where we'll probably get the most interesting discussion going. So just to kind of start off, I guess Impact Lab was started actually out of people working in government who saw that there's a lot of data sitting in government, but actually the people who could best use it are those out in communities who know the whānau and are working with them and could be empowered by that data to support the work that they're doing. So the vision really is, how do we make investment work for the communities we care about so that people can live the lives they choose? So I guess when it comes to what are outcomes, at the end of the day, as we see it, outcomes means people being able to live the lives they want to live, having the autonomy to form their own aspirations and to go after those. And I know that all of you in your work, that's what you're doing. You're supporting the aspirations of the people that you work with. So the question is, how do we connect decisions about investment, and particularly about monetary investment, to a view of those outcomes? Because sometimes it kind of feels like you've got the people and families we care about are over here, their aspirations, their reality, and we've heard a lot about that in the speeches in this conference. And then somewhere over here, we've got the investment decision makers, the policy decision makers, the decisions about kind of how the bureaucracy and the system is set up. And it's really hard to connect them. And so I guess our thinking is, what could really help make that connection is information flow, and particularly information flow about two things. Firstly, where is the money going that we're spending? And how is that actually translating into the support, the housing, the things that people are getting? And then on the other side, what difference is that support making to their lives? And how can we build confidence that the support is making the difference that we want? and also learn, because this is complex stuff, like learn about what's working and what isn't, and then use that information to improve how we invest going forward. And that's about the flow of money, but it's also the flow of strategic focus, energy, and time that you guys and the rest of the system are putting in. So that's kind of, I guess, why we've focused on connecting decision makers with data that you can trust, use, and learn from to do good better for the people that really matter. I will say, as I talk through a little bit how we measure, and Luke will cover this more, Impact Lab are not experts at all in the housing sector, and you guys have an amazing group of those. So what we're really focused on is how do we connect up the knowledge that already exists in communities, in academia, and in government to better understand investment. So I think that the overall opportunity is to shift decision-making from thinking about cost to thinking about value. And I fully copied this slide from the court Rapua pilot session, if any of you were there, because I like the arrow thing. But basically, the opportunity is to shift from thinking about, look, we're going to fund any housing for the average person, and then we're going to focus on basically minimizing the short-term financial cost of doing that. So that's one investment approach, is to say, look, just get everyone into a house at the minimum cost. But from what you guys know in your own experience is really what we need to support people's aspirations is quality housing that supports the aspirations of particular people with specific needs. And so really what we want to do is to maximize the long-term social value of the investment that we're making. And that might mean that we spend more now to get the right kind of housing in the right kind of place with the right kind of services and the right kind of navigation, so that in the long term, people are better positioned and supported to realize their aspirations. So that's the opportunity that we have, but in order to make that shift, because I think we'd all agree there's a lot of this that happens, and we need more of that, to make that shift, we've really got to make the case, and one part of that is using the data. So how can providers and funders use data about the outcomes they're creating? I'll talk a bit on providers, and then I'll hand to Kate to share a funder perspective. So I think from a provider perspective, there's a couple of reasons it's really important. The first one is so that you can be accountable to your core mission. And often the temptation is to be accountable to your contracts, which you do also need to do. But ultimately, it's about your kaupapa, and how do you build confidence that you are having the impact that you want according to the mission you've set for yourselves. The second thing is understanding the long-term difference that you're making for people, because I think that's one of the hard things is you have a relationship for a certain period of time, but then hopefully whānau leave and they succeed, but you don't get to see that. So how do you understand the long-term difference that you're making in the time that you're with people? The third thing is accessing sustainable funding streams so you can focus on the doing. And so I think the data kind of helps, as people have described, to make the case for the sustained long-term funding, which means you can then focus on the doing. And then the final piece is improving what you're delivering. Because once you start to get that data coming back to you, you might learn some really interesting things that can help you improve your service, improve your housing, learn from the users of your service to make it better. So these are all reasons, I guess, and you need a good one, right? You need a good reason to put energy and investment into something that is not the frontline work, but I think these are good reasons to put some energy into the data flows that exist in your organisation. I'll chuck over down to Kate for a moment just to talk from a funder perspective about Rata Foundation's investment in housing and why Rata is trying to improve the data that's available.
Thanks, Maria. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko wai au, no Ngāti Ngarihi Tokui, no Davin Mahau, e noho ana nai nei I o tautahi. Ko Kate Slater toku ingoa, he kaimahi mō te Rata Foundation. So I'm Kate Slater, I'm Head of Community Investment at Rata Foundation, and we're one of the 12 community trusts across New Zealand. And we cover the regions of Canterbury, Nelson, Marlborough, and the Chatham Islands, so Wharekaude. We are kind of purpose, our core light, if you like, leading light, is around striving for a sustainable and equitable society under the korowai of Te Tiriti. So very much focused on those equitable outcomes, which is, I think, partly the reason that we've partnered with Impact Lab around thinking about how do we reach those particularly vulnerable communities. And we have a set of kind of strategic PO, if you like. So they're health, education, the environment, and housing. So you know, some of the really easy things just to work on in the world. And for us, I think data and evidence are really important. So when we started thinking about our role in housing, we approached an expert in this field, so Kay Saville-Smith, and asked her to help us think about where we might best use our funding. And asked her to think about where might we put our limited resources, what are the key needs in the community, and where might we be best placed to act. We also think about how can we leverage other funding and who are our values-aligned partners, because we're a really relationship-based funder. So we like to think about how we can work with people who have similar values to ourselves. And unsurprisingly, given it was Kay, and you'll have heard her talking on the first day of the conference, she advised us that really where we might make a difference is in that kind of progressive home ownership space, affordable rental, but also in the financial capability building for whānau. And so we started on that journey of supporting projects in housing. And being a very kind of data-focused organisation, we started to think about what can we learn from this? What can we learn and what can we add to the knowledge base? Which is where we've partnered with Impact Lab. So we've worked with them before in our early years space and really been impressed with how the models that they use can help organisations to really think about the interventions they're having and think about how they might pivot and use that knowledge to really really make the best use of those services that they're doing and how they can focus even further on making a change in people's lives. So, as Maria was saying, as a funder, we're really interested in reaching, with our equity focus, we're really interested in reaching those parts of the community that other people may not be able to reach. And because we're working with these great organisations that we're partnering with, we're seeing, as everybody's been saying over the course of the conference, that it's really beyond bricks and mortar. The people that we're working with are really thinking about how they design the buildings. They're thinking about how they design the communities that people are living in. They're thinking about how it feels to be in those communities. They're thinking about those bumping spaces. And we started to think, well, how can we value the impact that those things that aren't just the bricks and mortar, aren't just the housing, that they have on people's lives? How can we think about that data, about the spaces and places? How can we think about the reduced power costs and about how people actually feel about how they're living and the neighbours around them? So we heard Joan on the video earlier talking about her new neighbours and how that made her feel connected and part of that community. And there's a value to that, but it's not necessarily able to be measured in dollar terms at this moment. And we're really curious about that. Because as we move into housing, unlike in most of our grant funding that we deliver, where we can make a reasonable impact with grant funding, we know that in housing, for us to make a really big impact, we're most likely to be able to make a greater impact using our balance sheet, so using investment to do that. But we're a trust in perpetuity, and we need to balance the kind of financial risk with the social return that we're providing. And we need some rigour around how we might value that. So we've been working with Impact Lab to really think about how can we put a value on all of those amazing things that are happening in community that we intrinsically know are good for people, we intrinsically know are having positive outcomes, and how can we put a value around that we can offset against the investments that we're making. So that's about understanding the people, as Maria was saying, really getting clear about those kind of nuanced approaches. So if that's housing for disabled people or people with learning disabilities, really understand what types of houses work well for those communities. And that's the kind of key driver for us. But it's also about shining a light on the amazing good practice that's happening out there, because we see it every day, and we've seen the amazing videos and great things that are happening in the community. And we see that's part of our role, to kind of uplift and tell those stories that are out there. And of course, it's also about contributing to that knowledge base, contributing to finding frameworks that can support other funders to think about their investments and how we can unlock some of these balance sheets that are sitting on community trusts and other organisations to help support the housing crisis in New Zealand. Kia ora. I'm going to hand it back to you, Maria.
Thanks very much, Kat. So then I guess the question is, how can we think about understanding the long-term value that your housing is creating? So I'll talk to this at a high level, and then I'll hand over to Luke to talk at a more detailed level. And I suppose we'll just cover it up here, but really happy to dive into the details that are of interest to you guys. So I'll start by saying, social value is only one way of thinking about the value you're creating. And it's probably not the most important. The most important is probably what you see is the experience of your tenants and residents and what they tell you about their experience. But what it can do is add another layer of data to that, which you can then turn into a dollar figure that can connect to the investment that's going into what you're providing. So this is a picture that kind of, I guess, describes the idea of social value. So the basic idea is, if you think of this line as the trajectory of somebody's life, or the life of a whānau, and it's got ups and it's got downs, and there's a lot of challenges, but there's also awesome things that happen. And then at some point, these people or this person comes into contact with a program or a service or a housing intervention. And at that point, there's this really big opportunity, which is to positively shift the future pathway that someone's life can take. And often we know, unfortunately, from the data, from government data, what pathways can look like without support based on where someone's coming from. And the question is, how and to what extent can that be shifted? And we heard a really cool analogy from another charity we worked with about the idea someone's life is kind of like a ship. And you might, as a provider, be able to shift that ship's direction by a few degrees. But in a 10, 20, 30 and intergenerational view, that could totally shift where that ship ends up. And so with the concept of social value, what we're trying to do is understand that shift, understand what do we know about who is in the housing, what do we know about the nature of the support that they experience, and then based on that, what can we forecast about how the future pathway of that person or the life of that whānau could change. And that's both about understanding the positive outcomes that can be achieved and also the negative outcomes that can be avoided. So we've done this process over 250 times with NGOs across all parts of the social sector. So youth development, sports, education, whānau ora, community health, all sorts of areas. But interestingly, what we've found is that if the housing's not right, it's really difficult for any of those other interventions to really make a difference. And across all the programs we've looked at, the number one reason that people exit programs early before they can meaningfully benefit is because they've moved house. So I think this story for housing actually is the story for how we enable change across all the other aspects of people's lives. So it's really important to be able to demonstrate this story. So how do we do that with data? Oh, well, the thing isn't moving. Oh, here we are. So there's really kind of, I guess, three types of data that we draw on in order to quantify social value. Because I should say, we do actually quantify that social value in dollar terms. And there's a few data points we can use to do that. So the first is the community voice and frontline experience. And so that's about understanding from who is doing the mahi, and if you have that information from the people who are receiving the service, what is it that they're experiencing? What does the actual process of change look like? And what are the outcomes that they're seeing occurring in people's lives? So we normally sit down with the teams and really work through that. Then you can layer onto that organizational knowledge. So this is the juicy data that sits in your tenancy management system, in your asset management system, on your spreadsheets, on your handwritten case notes, wherever it is, but it's the information about things like how much and how often and in what way are people engaging with your services. what is it that the people that you're working with want? Do you know about what their goals are? Do you know about what their previous housing situation was? Sometimes I know eligibility criteria can be very limiting, but sometimes that can give us clues to who it is that you're housing. So what is that organizational data that's sitting in your system that can tell us something about where people are coming from, what they're receiving, or where they're headed? And then the final set of data we link in is public and academic data. So the public data is about looking at particularly information about how people journey through government services. And then what are the income and government cost impacts of doing a good job with the housing. So for example, we worked with a provider in Tauranga that had provided transitional housing and follow-on support to a woman who had fled abuse, been living in her car for a year, got picked up by police and linked with this provider. And so she was then able to get in housing that was warm, safe and dry. So what are the flow-on health impacts to her and also to her new pepe of that? And what does that mean for things like reduction in respiratory illness, reduction in avoidable hospitalizations, reduction in primary health and prescription costs, because that mama and her baby are much healthier than they would have been living in that car for another year. But then we can also look at the longer term things. So for that wahine, what she said she wanted was, now that she had stable, sort of dry, okay housing, she was thinking to the future. She was thinking to, how do I get reunited with my kids? How do I get on a pathway to employment? And so we can look at things like reduction in oranga tamariki placements and the cost of that when it goes to the foster system, the OT system. We can look at reductions in things like drug addiction and the cost of that to the health system, and things like employment. You know, what's the income, long-term income impact of someone getting a house, being able to transition into long-term sustainable employment, and the impact on the poverty reduction in that family, as well as reduction in future MSD costs, as well as reduction in healthcare costs, because we see in the data strong links between employment and healthcare. So you can sort of start to see there's like this web of long-term system-level impact that gets created through that support at that moment and that relationship between that person and their housing provider and the other associated services. The other piece of this is the academic data. And this is where I think housing, you guys are really lucky because pretty much unlike any other sector we've worked in, firstly, there's a really rich evidence base that's Aotearoa specific about housing. Secondly, and maybe even more importantly, you've got academics who are deeply engaged with the sector and want to help people understand that evidence and use it, as we've seen from the speakers earlier in the conference. And so what we seek to do here is to draw on that really good quality, often longitudinal evidence to say, we can't necessarily track your people for the next 20 years, but we can find the most similar people and the best quality long-term research, and we can look at what those outcomes were and then make some conservative estimates about what that could mean. So that could be things like looking at what has been the impact of stable housing on school attendance and educational achievement. And we can look at what happened for similar populations and make some estimates about how your housing could be supporting educational achievement for your tamariki. So it's all about pulling all those data sets together to produce some simple metrics, like for every dollar that goes into this housing program, this is the value, social value to New Zealand that we can estimate. And the intent is you can then take that to certainly to your funders to make the case for investment, and especially to make the case for the right kind of investment that you know can lead to more value, and also for your own management teams to understand that long-term impact that you're having. So that's just, I guess, the high level on the data. I'll pass to Luke to talk about some of the specifics, and then we'll throw to some questions.
Yeah, so hello, I'm Luke. I'm the research lead at Impact Lab. What you can see here is a selection of some of the clients that we've worked with. And what we have done is we've tried to apply what we've learned across many different sectors, 250 organisations, many different intervention types, to create a social return on investment analysis specific for housing. And we've had a huge amount of learning working with the likes of Salvation Army, Court, Te Tuanga Whānau, and many others. So the approaches that we're taking is being informed by all of our work with these organisations, And we're also very grateful to have been able to work with experts such as Connell Smith, in particular, Kay Saville Smith, Rosemary Goodyear, and others that you see listed there. So to estimate social value, we are exploring some key questions with providers. As Maria was saying, who is in the housing? We often find that our clients don't necessarily have as much visibility on who is in the housing as they might have thought at the beginning, which is always very interesting. We look at what changes in their lives. So what actually happens as a result of the housing? That's also a process of discovery. To what extent and at what scale? So when we explore what changes in people's lives, what we're learning is that CHIPS can create social impact at many points on the housing spectrum. For example, when people without a home take residence in a home, right up to transitioning from a rental into home ownership and then generational transmission of home ownership. And as Maria has pointed out, existing research points to some of the key drivers of effectiveness. So we're learning what it means for impact, for example, when people can stay together and start to get some community effects. And we're also starting to build outcomes, an outcomes framework for houses of differing quality and reconciling all the measures that exist. And we're also learning, based on our work with all these other clients, it's important to consider the added services that CHIPS can provide. So not just the house, but all the wraparound services that can come with it, which can prove to be critical. And because of all of our work, we've built up a bank of those, which we can look at. So to understand population, we work with providers to define what it means to meaningfully engage with their service. And we look at how long people engage with housing and also the associated services, and then where the transitions are, as Maria said. And we're also very interested in costs because we want to work with CHIPS to understand the capital. This is the cost side of the social return on investment. We have to look at social value, but we also have to look at the capital value and how the social value relates to costs, because there are relationships. So what we're doing with Rata is building cost models and with our other housing partners, and we can see, all of us, how the escalating construction interest costs and tenant complexity, their needs, is starting to impact the sector. And what we want to do is work with CHIPS to meet that challenge. So these are an example of some of the outcomes that we look at within housing. These questions and the data that support them can be applied to a wide range of housing and populations, linking to this core set of outcomes. For example, part of Rata's vision is to achieve continuity in community and help people who face barriers to achieve home ownership. So within our outcome stack, we're starting to look at ownership outcomes. Whereas other CHIPS might be interested in emergency housing and transitional housing, getting people from homeless into housing. And we have a set of outcomes that can apply to that. Or a mix. So we can cover, we hope, any kind of population for any kind of housing at any point of the continuum, with a degree of confidence, understanding that we are still learning. We're at time, okay. Understood. I'll hand over to you, Maria.
Boss's prerogative. Thank you, Luke. So I guess that's just a bit of a snapshot. I think we're at time for the session. So I don't know, we could throw it open to a few questions if people want to hang around. Otherwise, please feel free to head off if you need to. Did anyone have any burning questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Gary Moore. I addressed this to Kate. I was on a trust which shared the Kay Saville Smith research with you and was very enthusiastic with the report we received. I eventually resigned from the trust in frustration because the trustees refused to look at anything beyond a return on capital rather than a return for people. And I I guess the question I have for you all is how do we shift the minds of the decision makers who are keeping their hand on the purse to look at the excellence of this sort of stuff? Because, you know, I think what Kay recommended to us was superb, but this adds greatly to it. How do we address that?
I'm quite short, and that's quite a high step. So, someone actually said to me earlier, Luke and I were connecting over lunch, and they wondered if we were going to do a comedy sketch because of the height difference. But I'll get him to stand next to me later. It's really hard, Gary, and I think we really want to unlock that, because the key to unlocking the financial question is about having the evidence to show that you can validate taking that additional risk. We have a process within our community loan program where we can discount interest rates based on the social outcome. We haven't done that yet in other forms of investment, but we know there's a mechanism there, but what we're unsure about is what is that value that we should be using. And I think this hopefully is the thing that helps us to unlock that, because it is a trade-off, isn't it? Do we make grants now, or do we make money from the balance sheet? And if you're having to trade off those two, then you need some really good data and evidence to show the value of why you're doing that. But it is, you know, it's really complex, and I share your kind of frustration at the speed. But the only way we're going to get there is by having rigor around it, and this, I suppose, is the attempt for us to have some rigor. So, yeah, thank you.
I'm just wondering, as a human rights lens over your criteria, you've got increasing home ownership, which I get under the income label, but that plays us into the capitalisation and financialisation of the housing market. So I'm just wondering about replacing that with something like security of tenure, which is possibly more attuned to a social outcome.
I love this question, and it's something, and as Luke mentioned, that word learning, we're shaping this with providers as we learn as well, and it's something we're noticing there's quite a few different views about. So that's the thing, like, to what extent does home ownership matter versus continuity of tenure and security of tenure? Because we know they're two different things, and they're both potentially really important. What I will say is, particularly we're hearing from Pacific providers, that home ownership is seen as a kind of key mechanism for improving intergenerational wealth. We haven't found, and maybe Neville knows more about this than we do, we haven't found good New Zealand evidence around that yet, but we have found some pretty good US evidence looking at thousands of data sets to show that you do get an incremental long-term and intergenerational income lift from just home ownership separate from other factors. So that's an area we want to explore. But I will say as well, you know, you might look at that list and there'll be some outcomes you care about and there'll be some you don't. And there'll be some outcomes funders care about and some they don't. And so the trick is to identify what matters to you in your context, and then that's where you should go heavy on the data, if that makes sense. It's a great question. Any others? Great, well, we'll close it off there. Thank you guys so much for your focus in an afternoon session. And we're just here, so get in touch if you want to explore or ask any questions or share any thoughts.